Okay. Before we finish,
Mhm.
okay, I need to vent to you about your Jordan Peterson conversation.
Yeah.
There's a thing that
Yeah.
happens, okay, that I fucking hate, and I know Peterson does this intentionally, okay?
Yeah.
It's this game that is played when somebody asks a question, when somebody asks you a question and you don't want to engage with the answer, and instead you endlessly obfuscate contextually on what's being asked, okay? Every single person in the world knows that when you ask the question, did Jews leave Egypt and cross the Sinai or whatever? Did that happen? You
Well,
know
it's like,
what's
does everybody know that, Stephen? Does
yes.
everybody know that? Because I mean, like, there are people in the room across the way right now
Uh-huh.
who haven't even heard you ask that question. They might not even have heard of
You're doing it now,
Egypt.
right?
So how would they?
You're doing it, yeah? You're doing the thing?
Well, I don't even know what you're talking. I don't even know what you're accusing. In fact, the very idea of having to accuse me of something means that you must have some kind of like standard by which you're judging me. And to be honest, if you didn't believe in that story, if you didn't believe that, let's say the what would you say, the value of individual autonomy over the sort of oppressive group force, and that,
Okay,
and,
so
that,
here-
and that standard
yes,
must be
okay.
sort of like okay,
There's two things that drive me crazy about this, okay?
yeah.
Here's one thing, okay? The first thing is that there is value in questioning some of the fundamental assumptions made in a question. I think there's value in that. You have to, but when you do this in philosophy, you question it and you explore the outer realms of your imagination so that you can bring it back to say something meaningful, right? Like I think an interesting response would be something like, well, did they cross the desert or did they not? When you ask me that, what does it actually mean? You say that might mean in a material sense they did, but let's say that I tell you that exists regardless of it materially happened or not. Regardless of it materially happened or not, it exists in an immaterial sense to us because it exists as a story. The fact of the matter is actually irrelevant. So you could explore the outer rim of that and you could bring it back. You could go, there are many things in history that we can extract valuable stories from, and whether materially they happened or they didn't, it really doesn't matter because they exist as an immaterial universal concept to us, or an immaterial concept to us that doesn't actually trace back to the fact of the matter, just the fact that the story exists. Like there's like a way you can do that, one, or okay, that's a way that you can take something, make it abstract, and then bring it back for value. But the thing that really drives me crazy, okay, about when people do that is the problem. I don't like it when Peterson does it. Is he only does it on certain topics.
Oh yeah.
Because when we talk about did the Jews leave Egypt? Well, that's a question that could be endlessly pontificate upon, consider.
It's like,
but when we ask about
more
like,
complicated than like you could possibly imagine,
So wait. So, but how does a guy who cannot even begin to come close to the horizon of declaring a material fact here or not have such a strong position on the efficacy of vaccines or the threat of climate change? Like, if there was anything to endlessly consider, would it not be some of the most macro policy topics in the world? Like, how can a guy who won't even approach a material analysis of those things be able to concretely tell you that all government that is large enough is bad? Like, where's the curiosity, the exploit? That drives me crazy.
I feel like they're different kinds of conversations.
No,
right?
they're not.
Because and I'm actually not doing the Peterson thing now.
I know you're
the religion topic. I mean, there are people who think that something like the Exodus story is mythological or is not, let's say, primarily a history text or something like this, and those are interesting conversations to have. And that's quite, for somebody who was a bit wishy-washy on that, it would be unfair, I think, to say, well, if you're so wishy-washy on that, why are you not so wishy-washy on your position on vaccines, for example? However, the thing that Peterson does, it's like, we've come back to this 3 times now. I don't mind you doing it, just
be aware of it.
Notice that you're doing it, right? Like saying something like, I mean, if you want to say, look, the Exodus story, I'm not really sure if it was historical. I don't know if it actually happened, but I'm sure that the main purpose of the story is not whether it was historical, but rather, like,
if you start off then everything else he says is fine.
But it seems to me that is basically what he's saying. He's just doing it in a roundabout way.
I disagree.
That like, well, as in, I think that's what his position probably actually is.
But he's smart enough to say that.
But that's what gets me, is that like
that.
I say, he is smart enough to know that, like, when I was asking him about, did it really happen, like with Jesus leaving the tomb and stuff, and he says, well, he's often said he doesn't really like the question, or like it sort of depends, and I'm sort of like, even if that's true, even if the question is inappropriate, even if you think it misses something important, you're smart enough to know, you know what you're being asked. You know what you're being asked. And even if the answer is, I don't know, or maybe, or probably, that's why I thought about how can I, the main thing I did was try to make sure in that conversation that every single question I asked preempted any possible derailment,
which is impossible.
Which required watching other people ask similar kinds of questions and seeing what sort of went wrong. Where did it go? And so with the question of Jesus' resurrection, you might say, but like the historical, and you immediately interrupt yourself and say, and I know you don't like this question, and you say, like the way I ended up wording it was so that it can't be like, well, what do you mean happened? What do you mean historically? I asked the question, if I took a Panasonic video camera and put it in front of the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, would the little LCD screen show a man exiting the tomb? To which he said, I would suspect yes. Whoa! I was like, and people have told me this afterwards. I spoke to Jonathan Pajot about this, who's a close, I think they're pretty close friends, Jordan Peterson and Jonathan, and they have, Jonathan Pajot has obviously had a big influence over Jordan's religious thinking, and then they've had endless conversations about religion. Like they're always talking about it with each other, sometimes like as a duo. And Jonathan said to me, I was kind of taken aback when he said that. And this is a man who's spent probably more time talking about religion with Jordan Peterson than maybe anybody else. And he was like, when you got him to say, I would suspect yes, to the question of whether Jesus exited the tomb, suddenly he was like, I think he might believe in the historicity of that event even more than I do.
Yeah.
And I think it was a result of knowing that Peterson does have a tendency to do this obfuscation, but also trying to understand as hard as I can why he does that.
I don't, but the thing that I have is that, it feels like it's an avoidance technique. It's not like one where he's so endlessly curious about a topic that his imagination is just running far ahead of him. He's trying to catch up to it. More so because any reasonable person knows what you're asking when you say that. Any priest will know, any rabbi, any teacher, any religious man will I grew up in a Catholic society. I went to a Jesuit high school and everything. Yeah. That if you were to ask a question like that, like, did this actually happen historically? They know exactly what you're asking, and they know the value that they want to give you, and they're going to walk between both worlds in a way that makes sense and is meaningful.
I do kind of get it that even if, like, I do actually think that he is sincere in his position that these religious questions are infinitely more complicated than other kinds of questions. Even if it's kind of a bit silly or a bit weird, I don't think he's trying to pull the wool over anyone's eyes. And if he is being an obscurantist, I don't think he's doing so knowingly. I would suspect that how he probably feels, from what I've seen, is a bit like if a quantum physicist was being asked by some like kid who had no idea, who didn't really know anything about physics, and let's face it, most people don't have a very thorough understanding of something like the biblical canon, right? They don't know the ins and outs of the stories and how they interlink, and they ask sort of a question about physics, and they've got like two objects, and they bang them together and say, why do the objects bounce off each other? And it's sort of like, oh well, it depends what you mean by objects, right? Because the objects don't bounce into each other, and because you're thinking in your head it's actually subatomic particles with negative charges that like repel each other at the subatomic level, and you're like, yeah, but like do the rocks like bounce off each other, yes or no? And you're sort of like, well, like it kind of depends what you mean by the rocks, and it also kind of depends what you mean by like bounce, because it's not really the rocks, it's kind of the atoms that make up and it's not really I
understand what you're saying. I fully reject this answer.
You'd suddenly start sounding a bit Petersonian in your sort of like,
but nobody says that. You would never say that. You know that objects don't truly touch each other, right? Because there's a different subatomic forces that are preventing actual, like there's no atoms colliding with each other here. But you would never give that answer to somebody, right? So even though you have the knowledge and you know that, like if a kid asks you that, like you're never saying that answer.
But this is the thing. This is why, although it might seem like, especially when consider that the kid might not be asking like, do the objects touch each other? They might be asking something which sort of relies on the assumption that things touch each other. So it might sort of be like, when one billiard ball knocks into another billiard ball, why does the third one, move away? When balls touch each other, why do they move in the same direction? And you'd have to start by being like, well, hold on, we need to actually break this down because, things don't actually touch. It's kind of subatomic. And it would start getting a bit like, oh, come on, man, stop beating around the bush. But you would at least be able to say something like, well, they don't actually touch. Like, they don't actually touch, but for all intents and purposes, at the macro level, we sort of act as if they do touch, and that's good enough. Right? That kind of answer is the equivalent to saying, well, I think historically the Exodus maybe didn't happen. I don't really know, but sort of as a mythological story, we can talk about it as if it did, or something like that. Like that kind of, so sort of the complication of the question, I don't think is like an unfair thing for him to do. I understand why he's doing it, and I think he's doing it sincerely.
I understand what you're saying. I just disagree. I think you can complicate a thing and bring it out, but you do that so that you can explore the topic and then kind of bring it back. But to pretend that you don't even know what's being asked, and then to walk it out into these like very obscure areas, especially when the question is like pretty fundamentally being asked, like, well, I'm just curious about this material fact of the matter. And like I said, again, if Peterson was like a random person, sure, but he's a communicator. He goes public. He wants to be understood. He wants to communicate these ideas to each other. He knows what a material fact is. And when asked about the material fact, he knows what's being asked. And he could just like, again, if he would have prefaced it with like a simple statement of like, I understand you're asking me, like, were there really people that walked out of the desert? And I'm not entirely sure on that, but here's why I don't think that matters. Yeah. That's like a more honest engagement with it.
And to be clear, like, I agree with your criticism. I guess what I'm trying to do is, defend the ghost of Peterson, seeing as he's not here to defend himself. Sure. But ultimately, I do come down on your position here, which is on your position here is how I should have emphasized that series of words. That, like, okay, man, it's a complicated topic, and it's not just as straightforward as like, oh, it's just some work of fiction, or oh, it's just a history. But like, it's obviously much more than that. But you know what you're being asked, man. You literally know what you're being asked, and it's inappropriate in certain contexts to do that. It's kind of like I made a similar comparison in this conversation with him to like witnessing a crime, and let's slightly adapt this analogy. Suppose like the police bring you in for questioning and they say, can you describe the suspect? And you sort of say, well, the guy had a lot of drive. He had a lot of drive about him, and I've got to say he seemed like a man of principle, and it's sort of like, well, obviously that's not the information we're after, like we want to know.
Sometimes I feel like Peterson's even more abstract. It's like they would ask him, they would say, could you describe the suspect? And Peterson would go, yes, I could. And he would walk away.
Or would be so out. And even then when they then say, well, hold on, Dr. Peterson, we just want to know what he looks like. And it's like, oh, you think that who a person is can be what condensed into what they look like. So if I'm blind and I meet someone, I don't get to know, I don't know who they are. And it's sort of like, well, and then you suddenly feel yourself in a position where you kind of want to defend against it. You're like, well, no, that's obviously not what I'm saying. Oh, well, then why are you asking the question? Why are you interested? It's like, no, Dr. Peterson, I'm just trying to ask you, what did the guy look like? And he's like, well, I reject the premise of your question.
Yeah.
And you can understand how he's got there, because if he doesn't, I mean, if he actually is thinking like, well, hold on, why are they trying to, if they're asking who this person is, why are they trying to condense this down to what he looks like? Then when they just basically say, whatever, man, but just tell me what it looks like anyway, then he'll be like, well, I don't even, like, literally the question, I can't even interact with that question anymore.
Yeah. And then I feel like you run back into...
But something's gone horribly wrong there, obviously.
Yeah, I feel like I think I brought this up several times now, where I feel like it's not even interesting what's happening. It's really just a breakdown in the language of the thing, to where all of the complicatedness is, ironically enough, what Peterson says. And he's like, did they leave the desert? And he's like, well, when you say did and they and leave, and you mean the desert, what do we mean by all of these things? And it's like, well, all of human language is incredibly abstract, as much as people might want to have you think it's not, right? When I walk into a room and I say like, hey, are you hungry for anything? I'm implying like 50 different things for that. Like if I were to walk into a room and say like, hey, are you hungry? And you were to say like, I am pretty hungry. And then I would just walk out and not talk to you.
And if I said to Jordan Peterson, well, like, what do you mean woman? Because like,
oh my God,
there's sort of like, you could say it's like biological sex, but then then he would probably be like, oh, up yours, woke moralists. Like we know what a woman is, and suddenly the language would become a lot more precise. I suspect, again, I don't know.
That's a good point. I should have brought that
here.
That's true.
What
does it mean when somebody's walking out of Egypt? Well, that's an incredibly... What is a woman?
Well,
an adult female with human reproductive gametes. It's like,
come on, you
became very, very concise, very quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. But then I think it's because one of these issues is politicized. When somebody, I've made this point before, when someone says, what is a woman? They're not actually interested in your definition of woman. It's a litmus test to see like what side you're on. I've pointed out in the past, once probably to like in what may have been a mistake on GB News, because like I should have seen that this was going to come from that particular audience, some of the commenters. The point that I made was, what is a woman? And somebody answers, adult human female, right?
So total.
And it's like okay, cool. But so the task that's fulfilled is you now know like what side they're on the issue. Like great, and maybe that's the purpose of the question. That's fine. But if you actually think that's a suitable definition, hold on, define adult.
Yeah, it's literally a tautology.
Define
like a female is a woman.
Female.
Like
what like all of these words are still going to have like further definitional problems. Now I made this point in GB News, so people were like, what? Like, female is not a nebulous concept. Like, yeah, whatever, man. I don't care. You're missing the point that I'm making, which is that like definitions are hard, man. They're really, really tricky, and you need to be consistent in either just saying like, no, it's very straightforward and things can be defined, in which case you can't do the whole Exodus thing, or you have to accept that, sometimes things are infinitely more complex than they seem, in which case you can't be so hard line on the science stuff. I don't know, man. Like the Peterson phenomenon is interesting, but I remember I was watching him talk about religion, and he's doing his classic. My friend Sheehan calls it the octopus trombone. This thing,
Okay.
But I was watching him talk with a friend, and they made this comment. I don't think they really listened to Peterson. But we were hearing him talk about religion and doing this all this stuff that we're talking about here, and they said he wouldn't be famous if this is what he was famous for.
Mm-hmm.
I thought, you know what, that's probably right. And like I don't really mean this as an insult, because Peterson is a smart guy and he says a lot of insightful things. But like if he started in the like religion debate sphere, if that's where he got going, if that's what he was a professor of and that's what he did, there's no way that he would have become as famous as he is, and people wouldn't be listening to him in the numbers that they're listening to him. But because he's through other means become so famous, now people listen to him on these issues with the same fervor that they would, the psychological stuff, which rightly so probably he became super famous for. And it's strange. And my assessment, or my prediction about Jordan Peterson is that he probably spends most of his time either with people who think he's like one of the smartest guys in the world, and so when he starts talking about like religion, wishy-washy stuff, they sort of maybe don't really get it, but they go, but it's Jordan.
Big words there.
It's like it's Jordan Peterson, but like so and they're sort of they're like trying to understand it. They're like, yeah, I can see it. Yeah, sure. And so he's either surrounded by people who are like, yeah, totally, absolutely, or by people who are saying, you're literally the worst human being I've ever met in my life and you should go and kill yourself, right? And what I was trying to do in my conversation with him was be somebody who would say, no, I think that this is an unhelpful approach to this question. I don't think you're making a lot of sense on this point, and I think you need to be more clear, but I also don't think you're some like idiot. I don't think you're like doing this because you're stupid and immoral, right? And that is surprisingly rare in online debate, especially when you're like debating with audiences of people. Like you're either getting people who are like, you've changed my life and you're the most amazing person in the world and I'm going to hang off every word you say, or people getting up on the mic and having their moment where they just tell you to fuck off, So I don't know, man. I also, I was on his show as you were on his show, and I feel like it's a different kind of dynamic to if I was having him on my show to have an interview, or much different from if we were having like a moderated debate on a third party platform. You know what I mean? And people have noticed this with me. They've noticed that I just like shift in tone totally between like a conversation like I'm having now, or if it's like a debate.
Yeah.
And I can't help but do it. I felt like I was a guest. I was glad to be invited. I was I'm reaching a whole new audience of people, and so it's going to be a bit sort of toned down. But ultimately, I think I agree with you. I mean, he didn't do it in your conversation, like not really at all.
We didn't, because we were on like very concrete topics that he would want to obfuscate on. He wants to like have strong positions here.
Notice the difference. Like watch the conversation I have with him, and watch the amount of times you have to it's starting to go a little bit, and you have to sort of reel it back in and be like, no, but hold on, you know what you're being asked. Like, can we ask these? You wouldn't have to ask questions like, the Panasonic video camera in front of the tomb thing on on a question of politics. You wouldn't need to break it down in that language because there's none of that sort of airy-fairiness. But he would say that that's because this is something that's intrinsic to religious discussion that just doesn't really exist in the political. So I suppose that would probably be his defense. But to find out for sure, he'll have to come on my show. So we'll try and make that happen at some point. Maybe when he gets his new book out, We Who Wrestle with God is the book that he's going on tour for, like now, even though the book isn't out yet, which I think is a pretty bold and respectable move.
Okay.
I don't know. I imagine you'll probably. I don't know. Do you think you'll?
No, he isn't happy with me now. So
really,
feels like all the shows he goes on. He said that I argue just to be right.
Oh, sure. Yeah, actually, no. Which
is very annoying.
He did.
It's annoying because there's on a lot of these like larger shows I go on, I dial it back a lot to try to be like very gentle with the people. And it was with him and with Candace Owens. They both came away feeling like I was being too aggressive. It's like I was so gentle, and I am irritated that you still have this negative impression.
You don't think you were aggressive in that conversation
with Peterson?
Yeah,
not anywhere near the level I could have been. Yeah, and I feel like he was leading with most of the aggression, which I'm happy to follow. Yeah. But I also like pull it back. But
I mean, I'm fine. I mean, it's exciting and it's raw and it's passionate. I mean, I'm not condemning him for it, but it definitely seemed that in those moments of passionate outburst, they were coming from Peterson. I think.
Which I'm fine with. I have no problem with that.
And so where do you think he's got this idea? I mean, I think he said it on Matt Fradd's show on Pints with Aquinas. He said something like, well, when I was younger, I used to sort of argue to be right. That's what I cared about. And he seemed to sort of identify that quality in you. Where do you think that came from?
I don't know if it was just comments or what, but like comments that he saw, then he got asked Matt about it. But the way that I feel when I hear people say things like that is if you don't provide an example, I assume that you're emoting something different, that you're just unhappy with the way the conversation went. It's a lot of like standard copy pasted critique that I get of like, this guy just reads Wikipedia this guy just, he just like screams at people, blah, blah. It's like, okay, well, like, show me where I was like wrong on a particular thing. Then.
Yeah, didn't Joe Rogan say that about you at some point?
Yeah, he made
some like Wikipedia.
That joke carries very, very, very far. Yeah,
yeah, that's it's extraordinary. Hey, at least you're in the popular conscience, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I am. Yeah, but it's still very frustrating.
Publicity, something.
No, that doesn't work. It's not true.
Not when it's
you saw what we just talked about the cornstarch and the Stonehenge. All publicity is not necessarily good publicity, but people don't even know what the good criticisms of Wikipedia are. But yeah.